Comparing Communism and Fascism, Part 2. Nationalism. Communism purported itself to be an internationalist movement. In many ways, this is correct. Organizations like the Communist International, or Comintern, sought to coordinate communist movements worldwide. There was much international cooperation between communist regimes the world over, particularly when one looks to the Soviet Union providing aid to their comrades in other countries. The official anthem of the Soviet Union and other communist or socialist movements is titled The International. One of the lines of the refrain declares, "The International unites the human race." The founders of the Marxist-Leninist variants of communism directly expressed this internationalist commitment. Leon Trotsky wrote that the proletarian revolution by its nature must be an international affair. Quote, "The international development of capitalism implies the international character of the proletarian revolution," unquote. Need one be reminded of the last line of the Communist Manifesto, quote, "Workers of the world, unite," unquote. While internationalism was a key aspect of communist ideology and a key reason why the fascists opposed the communists, nevertheless, in practice, many of the communist regimes shunted aside the bonds of international solidarity when it fit them. Often, communist regimes were fiercely nationalistic in both rhetoric and action. Furthermore, most of the communist movements of the mid to late 20th century were also nationalist independence movements. This can be seen explicitly in the Second World War experience of the Soviet Union. During the war and the decades after, the official Soviet term for the war was the Great Patriotic War. On a bluff overlooking the city of Volgograd stands a statue of a woman. She wields a stone sword and towers 100 feet over the city. Buried under her feet are the bodies of over 30,000 Soviet soldiers. She was unveiled in 1967 in order to commemorate the Battle of Stalingrad. Not only does it serve as a monument to the sacrifices of the war, it also symbolizes Russian might on the world stage. Julia Chidaga observes, quote, "The statue's status as the largest sculpture in the world at the time of completion sent a strong message to the world that Russia was strong, powerful, and important, and would not be intimidated," unquote. The title of this massive piece of artwork directly invokes Russian nationalism and national identity. It is named "The Motherland Calls." The use of a woman in symbolizing the sacrifice of the war directly relates to prior Russian nationalist sentiment. Chidaga writes, quote, "The mother figure in The Motherland Calls, with her defiant expression and large sword, ultimately represents the archetypal image of the Russian motherland," unquote. Nor was this sense of nationalism solely present, let alone sparked, by the Nazi invasion. Well before the war, there had been a growing Soviet nationalism and Soviet patriotism. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick observes this directly. She writes, quote, "The new Soviet patriotism, which contained a large dose of old-fashioned Russian nationalism, manifested itself in many ways. The term Rodina, motherland, despised by the old Bolshevik internationalists, came back into common use. In the arts, the campaign against formalism in the mid-1930s had distinct xenophobic overtones, foreshadowing the anti-cosmopolitan campaigns of the late 1940s, unquote. Soviet patriotism and nationalism were long-running trends and a key part of Stalinism. Historian Vladimir Tismanu writes, quote, "During mature Stalinism, Soviet patriotism became an apology for national authenticity, pride, and loyalty. At the same time, the Soviet Union became a site of large-scale ethnic cleansing," unquote. Further, given Soviet propaganda that they had achieved a classless society through the elimination of opposing classes, it seems only natural that antagonisms would turn outwards. Historian David Priestland observes, quote, "The unified Narod people. Now, no longer divided by class, embodied socialism and was to achieve heroic feats in the struggle against largely external enemies." Unquote. This nationalism is not only present in the Soviet Union, it shows itself in nearly every other communist movement around the world. Historian Benedict Anderson writes in his extensive work on nationalism, quote, "Since World War II, every successful revolution has been defined in national terms. People's Republic of China, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and so forth, and in so doing has grounded itself firmly in a territorial and social space inherited from the pre-revolutionary past." Unquote. The movements that stood opposed to Western imperialism and in favor of national independence were very often dominated by communist groups, or at the very least, the communists were a significant minority. Historian Jean-Louis Margolin notes how many Chinese communist activists, quote, "rallied to communism as a radical form of nationalism," unquote. In many ways, Mao Zedong is lauded as a national Chinese hero, having usurped the boot of Western imperialism. In Vietnam, the core of the anti-French and anti-Japanese resistance was dominated by the communist leader Ho Chi Minh. After a failed attempt at a nationalist uprising in 1929, quote, "the Communist Party of Vietnam was left as the main focus of nationalist resistance in Vietnam," unquote. The leaked internal CIA history of the Vietnam War, known as the Pentagon Papers, describes Ho Chi Minh as, quote, "the only Vietnamese wartime leader with a national following," unquote. Following the Second World War, Vietnam issued its own Declaration of Independence. The document utilizes expressly nationalist rhetoric. Quote, "The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against any attempt by the French colonialists to reconquer their country," unquote. Furthermore, the communist guerrilla movement in South Vietnam that the United States fought so hard to eradicate was officially known as the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. In Cuba, Castro benefited greatly from nationalist sentiments and anti-American hatreds. In many ways, the 1959 Cuban Revolution was a nationalist revolution to remove the heavy-handed influence of the United States from the shores of the island nation. Historian Richard Gott notes how, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, quote, "Castro had harnessed his revolutionary chariot to the powerful forces of a renewed Cuban nationalism and was beyond challenge," unquote. Historian Pierre Rigolot notes that in Korea as well, quote, "Korean communists were at the forefront in the struggle for national independence," unquote. The example of North Korea is very informative in noting communist nationalism. The official website of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea proudly proclaims, quote, "The Korean people value the independence of the country and nation, and under the pressure of imperialists and dominationists have thoroughly implemented the principle of independence, self-reliance, and self-defense, defending the country's sovereignty and dignity firmly. It is an invariable policy of the government of the Republic, guided by the Juche idea, to treasure the Juche character and national character and maintain and realize them. The government of the Republic always adheres to the principles of Juche, the principle of national independence, and thus is carrying out the socialist cause of Juche," unquote. Often described as the hermit kingdom, the regime is extremely xenophobic. Quote, "Korean leaders feared that influence from the outside world might corrupt the ideological unity of the people and the party," unquote. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, quote, "People are to be constantly alert, on the lookout for the imperialist enemy," unquote. North Korea is fiercely nationalistic and isolationist. This can be seen clearly in their particular brand of communism, Juche. Juche is often translated as self-reliance, and in many ways reflects the North Korean belief that they are particularly special insofar as they implemented communism correctly, whereas it failed everywhere else. Furthermore, North Korean propaganda often tries to portray the great leader, Kim Il-sung, as, quote, a bona fide Korean nationalist guerrilla fighter who personally pushed the Japanese off the peninsula in World War II, only to repel a U.S. invasion 5 years later, unquote. Other variants of North Korean propaganda are deeply xenophobic. Quote, imagery strongly implies that all foreigners are morally inferior, unquote. This nationalist propaganda is filtered all the way down to children. Some math textbooks in schools offer problems like, quote, 3 People's Army soldiers rubbed out 30 American bastards. What was the ratio of the soldiers who fought, unquote. This xenophobia is even present in children's television in North Korea. A prominent television show, arguably the most popular North Korean show, is a series titled The Squirrel and the Hedgehog. It has been premiering new episodes for nearly 4 decades and features, quote, the ongoing story about how a group of young and patriotic squirrels strive to defend their country, termed Flower Hill, from a number of hostile military invaders. Their main opponents are the wolves and the weasels, who exercise a slave-like dominion over a group of mice, unquote. As part of this xenophobia and isolationism, the secret police often pay particular attention to those who have traveled abroad or have received guests from abroad, let alone foreign visitors themselves. And one final example of North Korea that demonstrates both their brutality and vicious nationalism. Several people were apprehended trying to cross the border in 1997, trying to escape the nightmare of North Korea. The following is a news account of what happened to them as officially reported by the regime. Quote, the police who picked up the fugitives held them together by putting a wire through the cheeks or noses of these traitors to the nation who had dared to try to leave the fatherland. As soon as they reached their destination, they were executed, and their families were sent to labor camps, unquote. Similarly, during the Second World War, the anti-Nazi and nationalist resistance movements likewise predominantly featured communist agitators. Greek communist partisans were explicitly nationalist and organized themselves under names like the National Liberation Front or People's Army for National Liberation. Nikos Zachariadis, a key leader in the Greek Communist Party, put out a rallying cry in 1940. Quote, the Greek nation is now engaged in a war for its national liberation from the fascism of Mussolini. Everyone must take his place and everyone must fight, unquote. Similarly, Josip Broz Tito, who would become the dictator of Yugoslavia, cut his teeth as a guerrilla fighter against German occupation. Many communist parties in Central and Southeastern Europe had been prominent, if not dominant, in the national resistance movements against the Nazis and the Italian fascists. Many communist leaders in Central and Southern Europe after the war often referred to the, quote, national road to socialism, unquote, that they sought to strive toward. Furthermore, despite the existence of the Comintern, communist nations were often at odds with one another. Oftentimes, these conflicts focused upon which communist nation would be the center of the global revolution. This is the source of the infamous split between the USSR and the People's Republic of China. In many ways, Maoism was a close competitor with Leninism for the progeny of global revolution. Both Beijing and Moscow saw themselves as being at the forefront of this revolution. Not only can this be seen in the Sino-Soviet split, but it can be seen earlier with the schism between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Josip Tito refused to toe the Comintern's line and defied the orders of Stalin. For this, Yugoslavia and its regime were accused of deviationism. This deviation was partly an expression of Yugoslavian nationalist sentiment as well as independence. The Soviet Union and its satellites further engaged in the persecution of so-called Titoists. Purges of potential enemies were justified by this nationalist confrontation. Quote, links with Tito were used as arguments to demonstrate the political unreliability of certain East European leaders, unquote. As historians Courtois and Panet note, quote, having challenged Stalin's omnipotence, Tito was transformed into a new Trotsky, unquote. Not only were followers of Tito persecuted throughout Eastern Europe, but Tito also was targeted multiple times for assassination by Soviet agents. Having survived multiple attempts, in 1948, Tito threatened Stalin in this way, quote, stop sending people to kill me. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow, and I won't have to send a second, unquote. Tito stood against Stalin in favor of his own nationalist expression of communism. Stalin, likewise, tried to eliminate Tito as a threat to the Soviet implementation of communism. Besides mere rhetorical or political jousting between the regimes, oftentimes there was actual violence between the different communist nations. Benedict Anderson notes the conflict between Vietnam and Cambodia, the conflict between China and Vietnam, the border clashes between the Soviet Union and China, the Soviet interventions throughout Eastern Europe, as well as examples of communists behaving in nationalistic ways. The border clashes between the USSR and the People's Republic of China in 1968 were particularly dangerous. In China, preparations were being made for a, quote, forthcoming war against Soviet revisionism, unquote. In such a war, the Chinese feared the Soviets would use nuclear weapons. The Soviets, likewise, were afraid the Chinese would use nuclear weapons. Thankfully, these border clashes did not escalate any further. There is some irony that a nuclear war almost started between two communist nations. All of these examples should do much to demonstrate how communist regimes often engaged in the same kind of nationalistic fervor that the fascists engaged in. Despite the internationalist rhetoric, in practice, the communist movements were often populated by fierce nationalists.